Happy Friday, everybody. Let's have a look at chapter 47. Down in the dungeons. The kitchen workers in the palace were most surprised to hear from Lord Spittleworth that Mrs. Beamish had requested her own separate kitchen because she was so much more important than they were. Indeed, some of them were suspicious because Mrs. Beamish had never been stuck up in all the years they'd known her. However, as her cakes and pastries were still appearing regularly at the king's table, they knew she was alive wherever she was, and like many of their fellow countrymen, their servants decided it was safest not to ask questions. Meanwhile, life in the palace dungeons had been utterly transformed. A stove had been fitted in Mrs. Beamish's cell, her pots and pans had been brought down from the kitchens, and the prisoners in neighbouring cells had been trained up to help her perform the different tasks that went into producing the feather-light pastries that made her the best baker in the kingdom. She demanded the doubling of the prisoners' rations to make sure they were strong enough to whisk and fold, to measure and weigh and to sift and pour, and a rat catcher to clean the place of vermin, and a servant to run between the cells, handing out different implements through the bars. The heat from the stove dried out the damp walls. Delicious smells replaced the stench of mould and dank water. Mrs. Beamish insisted that each of the prisoners had to taste a finished cake so they understood the results of their efforts. Slowly the dungeon started to be a place of activity, even of cheerfulness, and the prisoners who'd been weak and starving before Mrs. Beamish arrived were gradually fattening up. In this way she kept busy and tried to distract herself from her worries about Bert. All the time the rest of the prisoners baked, Mr. Dovetail sang the national anthem and kept carving giant Ickabog feet in the cell next door. His singing and banging had enraged the prisoners before Mrs. Beamish arrived, but now she encouraged everyone to join in with him. The sound of all the prisoners singing the national anthem drowned out the perpetual noises of his hammer and chisel, and the best of it was that when Spittleworth ran down into the dungeons to tell them to stop making such a racket, Mrs. Beamish said innocently that surely it was treason to stop people singing the national anthem. Spittleworth looked foolish at that, and all the prisoners bellowed with laughter. With a leap of joy, Mrs. Beamish thought she'd heard a weak, wheezy chuckle from the cell next door. Mrs. Beamish might not have known much about madness, but she knew how to rescue things that seemed spoiled, like curdled sauces and falling soufflés. She believed Mr. Dovetail's broken mind might yet be mended if only he could be brought to understand that he wasn't alone, and to remember who he was, and so every now and then Mrs. Beamish would suggest songs other than the national anthem, trying to jolt Mr. Dovetail's memory, poor mind, onto a different course that might bring him back to himself. And at last, to her joy and and at last, to her amazement and joy, she heard him joining in with the Ickabog drinking song, which had been popular even in the days long before people thought the monster was real. I drank a single bottle, and the Ickabog's a lie. I drank another bottle, and I thought I heard it sigh. And now I've drunk another, I can see it's slinking by. The Ickabog is coming, so let's drink before we die. Setting down the tray of cake she'd just taken out of the stove, Mrs. Beamish jumped up on her bed and spoke softly through the crack high in the wall. Daniel Dovetail, I heard you singing that silly song. It's Bertha Beamish here, your old friend. Remember me? We used to sing that a long time ago when the children were tiny. My Bert and your Daisy. Do you remember that, Dan? She waited for a response, and in a little while she thought she heard a sob. You may think this strange, but Mrs. Beamish was glad to hear Mr. Dovetail cry, because tears can heal a mind as well as laughter. And that night, and for many nights afterwards, Mrs. Beamish talked softly to Mr. Dovetail through the crack in the wall, and after a while he began to talk back. Mrs. Beamish told Mr. Dovetail how terribly she regretted telling the kitchen maid what he'd said about the Ickabog, and Mr. Dovetail told her how wretched he'd felt afterwards for suggesting that Major Beamish had fallen off his horse, and each promised the other that their child was alive because they had to believe it or die. A freezing chill was now stealing into the dungeons through its high, tiny barred windows, and the prisoners could tell a hard winter was approaching. Yet the dungeon had become a place of hope and healing. Mrs. Beamish kept demanding more blankets for all her helpers and kept her stove burning all night, determined that they would survive. Oh, Mrs. Beamish seems like a great lady, doesn't she? Chapter 48. Bert and Daisy find each other. Oh, how exciting. The chill of winter was felt in Ma Grunter's orphanage too. Children in rags were fed only on cabbage soup. Children in rags who are fed only on cabbage soup cannot withstand coughs and cold as easily as children who are well fed. The little cemetery at the back of the orphanage saw a steady stream of Johns and Janes who died for lack of food and warmth and love, and they were buried without anybody knowing their real names, although the other children mourned them. The sudden spate of deaths was the reason Ma Grunter had sent Basher John out onto the streets of Jeroboam to round up as many homeless children as he could find to keep up her numbers. Inspectors came to visit 3 times a year to make sure she wasn't lying about how many children were in her care. She preferred to take in older children, if possible, because they were hardier than the little ones. The gold she received for each child now made Ma Grunter's private rooms in the orphanage some of the most luxurious in Cornucopia. With a blazing fire and deep velvet armchairs, thick silk rugs, and a bed with soft woolen blankets, her table was always provided with the finest food and wine. The starving children caught whiffs of heaven as Barronstown pies and Ickabog cheeses passed into Ma Grunter's apartment. She rarely left her rooms now except to greet the inspectors, leaving Basher John to manage the children. Daisy Dovetail paid little attention to the 2 new boys when they first arrived. They were dirty and ragged, as were all newcomers. Daisy and Martha were busy trying to keep as many of the smaller children alive as was possible. They went hungry themselves to make sure the little ones got enough to eat, and Daisy carried bruises from Basher John's cane because she often inserted herself between him and a smaller child he was trying to hit. If she thought about the new boys at all, it was to despise them for agreeing to be called John without putting up any sort of fight. She wasn't to know that it suited the 2 boys very well for nobody to know their real names. A week after Bert and Roderick arrived at the orphanage, Daisy and her best friend Martha had held a secret birthday party for Hetty Hopkins' twins. Many of the younger children didn't know when their birthdays were, so Daisy picked a date for them and always made sure it was celebrated, if only with a double portion of cabbage soup. She and Martha always encouraged the little ones to remember their real names too, although they taught them to call each other John and Jane if in front of Basher John. Daisy had a special treat for the twins. She'd actually managed to steal 2 real Shoeville pastries from a delivery from Ma Grunter several days before and saved them for the twins' birthday, even though the smell of the pastries had tortured Daisy and it had been hard to resist eating them herself. "Oh, it's lovely," sighed the little girl through tears of joy. "Lovely," echoed her brother. "Those came from Shoeville, which is the capital," Daisy told them. She tried to teach the smaller children the things she remembered from her own interrupted school days, and often described the cities they'd never seen. Martha liked hearing about Ickabog, Barron and Shoeville too, because she'd never lived anywhere but the marshlands in Ma Grunter's orphanage. The twins had just swallowed the last crumbs of their pastries when Basher John came bursting into the room. Daisy tried to hide the plate on which there was a trace of cream, but Basher John had spotted it. "You," he bellowed, approaching Daisy with the cane held up over his head, "have been stealing again, ugly Jane." He was about to bring it down on her when suddenly he found it caught in mid-air. Bert had heard shouting and gone to find out what was going on. Seeing that Basher John had cornered a skinny girl in much patched overalls, Bert grabbed and held the cane on the way down. "Don't you dare," Bert told Basher John in a low growl. For the first time, Daisy heard the new boy's Shoeville accent, but he looked so much different to the Bert she'd once known. So much older, so much harder faced that she didn't recognise him. As for Bert, who remembered Daisy as a little olive-skinned girl with brown pigtails, he had no idea he'd ever met this girl with the burning eyes before. Basher John tried to pull his cane free of Bert's grip, but Roderick came to Bert's aid. There was a short fight, and for the first time in any of the children's memories, Basher John lost. Finally, vowing revenge, he left the room with a cut lip, and as word spread in whispers around the orphanage that the 2 new boys had rescued Daisy and the twins, and that Basher John had slunk off looking stupid. Later that evening, when all the orphanage children were settling down for bed, Bert and Daisy passed each other on the upstairs landing, and they paused a little awkwardly to talk to each other. "Thank you very much," said Daisy, "for earlier." "You're welcome," said Bert. "Does he often behave like that?" "Quite often," said Daisy with a little shrug. "But the twins got their pastries. I'm very grateful." Bert now thought he saw something familiar in the shape of Daisy's voice, and he heard the trace of Shoeville in her voice. Then he looked down at the ancient, much-washed overalls, onto which Daisy had to sew extra lengths to the legs. "What's your name?" he asked. Daisy glanced around to make sure they weren't overheard. "Daisy," she said, "but you must remember to call me Jane when Basher John's around." "Daisy?" gasped Bert. "Daisy, it's me, Bert Beamish." Daisy's mouth fell open, and before they knew it, they were hugging and crying as though they'd been transformed back into small children in those sunlit days in the palace courtyard before Daisy's mother had died and Bert's father had been killed, when Cornucopia had seemed like the happiest place on earth. Oh, how nice. Well, let's carry on because we'll see what happens. Chapter 49, Escape from Ma Grunter's. Children generally stayed at Ma Grunter's orphanage until she threw them out onto the street. She received no gold for looking after grown men and women, and had allowed Basher John only to stay because he was useful to her. While they were still worth gold, Ma Grunter made sure no children escaped by keeping the doors securely locked and bolted. Only Basher John had keys, and the last boy who tried to steal them had spent months recovering from his injuries. Daisy and Martha both knew the time was coming when they'd be thrown out, but they were less worried for themselves than for what would become of the little ones once they were gone. Bert and Roderick knew they'd have to leave around the same time, if not sooner. They weren't able to check and see whether wanted posters with Bert's face on them were still stuck on the walls of Jeroboam, but it seemed unlikely that they'd been taken down. They've all lived in daily dread that Ma Grunter and Basher John would realise they had a valuable fugitive worth 100 gold ducats under the roof. In the meantime, Bert, Daisy, Martha and Roderick met every night while the other children were asleep to share their stories and pool their knowledge about what was going on in Cornucopia. They held these meetings in the only place Basher John never went, the large cabbage cupboard in the kitchen. Roderick, who'd been raised to make jokes about the Marshlanders, laughed at Martha's accent during the first of these meetings, but Daisy told him off so fiercely that he didn't do it again. Huddled around a single candle as though it were a fire, amid mounds of tough, smelly cabbages, Daisy told the boys about her kidnap. Bert shared his fear that his father had died in some kind of accident, and Roderick explained about the way the Dark Footers faked attacks on towns to keep people believing in the Ickabog. He also told the others about how the mail was intercepted, how the two lords were stealing wagon loads of gold from the country, and that hundreds of people had been killed, or if they were useful to Spittleworth, in some way imprisoned. However, each of the boys was hiding something, and I'll tell you what it was. Roderick suspected that Major Beamish had been accidentally shot on the marsh all those years ago, but he hadn't told Bert that because he was scared his friend would blame him for not telling him sooner. Meanwhile, Bert, who was certain Mr. Dovetail had carved the giant feet of the Dark Footers were users, didn't tell Daisy so. You see, he was certain Mr. Dovetail must have been killed after making them, and he didn't want to give Daisy false hope that he was still alive. As Roderick didn't know who'd carved the many sets of feet used by the Dark Footers, Daisy had no idea about her father's part in the attacks. But what about the soldiers? Daisy asked Roderick on the 6th night they met in the cabbage cupboard. The Ickabog Defence Brigade and the Royal Guard. Are they in on it? I think they must be, said Roderick, but only the very top people know everything. The two lords and whoever's replaced my father, he said and fell silent for a while. The soldiers must know there's no Ickabog, said Bert, after all the time they've spent up in the marshlands. There is an Ickabog, said Martha. There is an Ickabog, though, said Martha. Rod didn't laugh, though he might have done if he'd just met her. Daisy ignored Martha as she usually did, but Bert said kindly, I believed in it myself until I realised what was really going on. The foursome went off to bed later that night, agreeing to meet again the following evening. Each was burning with the ambition to save the country, but they kept coming back to the fact that without any weapons they could hardly fight Spittleworth and his many soldiers. However, when the girls arrived in the cabbage cupboard on the 7th night, Bert knew from their expressions something bad had happened. Trouble, whispered Daisy as soon as Martha had closed the cupboard door. We heard Ma Grunter and Basher John talking just before bed. There's an orphanage inspector on the way. He'll be here tomorrow afternoon. The boys looked at each other, extremely worried. The last thing they wanted was for an outsider to recognise them as two fugitives. We have to leave, said Bert to Roderick. Now, tonight, together. We can manage to get the keys from Basher John. I'm game, said Roderick, clenching his fist. Well, Martha and I are coming with you, said Daisy. We've thought of a plan. What plan? Asked Bert. I say the four of us head north to the soldiers' camp in the marshlands, said Daisy. Martha knows the way. She can guide us. When we get there, we tell the soldiers everything Roderick's told us about the Ickabog being fake. It's real, though, said Martha, but the others three ignored her, and about the killings and all the gold Spittleworth and Flapoon has stolen from the country. Bruno, it's a dog on the television. We can't take on Spittleworth alone. There must be some good soldiers who'd stop obeying him and help us take the country back. It's a good plan. Where were we up to? Sorry, Bruno's barking at a dog on the television. It's a good plan, said Bert slowly, but I don't think you girls should come. It might be dangerous. Roderick and I will do it. Well, that's a very outdated approach. No, Bert, said Daisy, her eyes almost feverish. With four of us, we double our numbers of soldiers we can talk to. Please don't argue. Unless something changes soon, most of the children in this orphanage will be in the cemetery before the winter's over. It took a little more argument for Bert to agree that 2 girls should come, because he privately worried that Daisy and Martha were too frail to make the journey, but at last he agreed. "All right, you better grab your blankets from off your beds, because it's going to be a long, cold walk. Roddy and I will deal with Basher John." So Bert and Roderick sneaked into Basher John's room. The fight was short and brutal. It was lucky Ma Grunter had drunk 2 whole bottles of wine with her dinner, because otherwise all the banging and shouting would definitely have woken her. Leaving Basher John bloody and bruised, Roderick stole his boots. Then they locked him in his own room, and the 2 boys sprinted to join the girls who were waiting beside the front door. It took 5 long minutes to unfasten all the padlocks and loosen all the chains. A blast of icy air met them as they opened the door. With one last glance back at the orphanage, threadbare blankets around their soldiers, Daisy, Bert, Martha and Roderick slipped out into the street and set off in the marshlands through the first few flakes of snow. I think there's one more chapter before we've fully caught up, so let's have a go at chapter 50. Now, I don't know about you, but I'm starting to believe, Martha, that there is an Ickabog. Chapter 50, A Winter's Journey. No harder journey had been made in all of Cornucopia's history than the trek of those 4 young people to the marshlands. It was the bitterest winter the kingdom had seen for 100 years, and by the time the dark outline of Jeroboam had vanished behind them, the snow was falling so thickly it dazzled their eyes with whiteness. Their thin patched clothes and their torn blankets were no match for the freezing air, which bit at every part of them like tiny, sharp-toothed wolves. If not for Martha, it would have been impossible to find their way, but she was familiar with the country north of Jeroboam, and in spite of the thick snow covering every landmark, she recognised old trees she used to climb, odd-shaped rocks that had always been there, and ramshackle sheep sheds that had once belonged to neighbours. Even so, the further north they travelled, the more all of them wondered in their hearts whether the journey would kill them. Though they never spoke the thought aloud, each felt their body plead with them to stop, to lie down in the icy straw of some abandoned barn and give up. On the 3rd night, Martha knew they were close, because she could smell the familiar ooze and brackish water of the marsh. All of them regained a little hope. They strained their eyes for any signs of torches and fires in the soldiers' encampment, and imagined they heard men talking and the jingling of horses' harnesses through the whistling wind. Every now and again they saw a glint in the distance or heard a noise, but it was always just the moonlight reflecting on the frozen puddle, or a tree creaking in the blizzard. At last they reached the end of the wide expanse of rock, marsh and rustling weed, and they realised there were no soldiers there at all. The winter storms had caused a retreat. The commander, who was privately certain there was no Ickabog, had decided he wasn't going to let his men freeze to death just to please Lord Spittleworth, so he'd given the order to head south. And if it hadn't been for the thick snow, which was still falling so fast it covered all the tracks, the friends might have been able to see the soldiers' 5-day-old footprints going in the opposite direction. "Look," said Roderick, pointing as he shivered, "they were here." Our wagon had been abandoned in the snow because it got stuck, and the soldiers wanted to escape the storm quickly. The foursome approached the wagon and saw food. Food such as Bert, Daisy and Roderick remembered only from their dreams, and which Martha had never seen in her life. Heaps of creamy Kurdish cheeses, piles of Shoeville pastry, sausage and venison pies of Barronstown, all sent to keep the camp commander and his soldiers happy, because there was no food to be had up in the marshlands. Bert reached out numb fingers to try and take a pie, but a thick layer of ice now covered the food, and his fingers simply slid off. He turned a hopeless face to Daisy, Martha and Roderick, all of whose lips were now blue. Nobody said anything. They knew they were going to die of the cold on the edge of the Ickabog's marsh, and none of them really cared any longer. Daisy was so cold that to sleep forever seemed a wonderful idea. She barely felt the added chill as she sank slowly into the snow. Bert sank down and put his arms around her, but he too was feeling sleepy and strange. Martha leant up against Roderick, who tried to draw her under his blanket. Huddled together beside the wagon, all 4 were soon unconscious, and the snow crept up their bodies as the moon began to rise. And then a vast shadow rippled over them. 2 enormous arms covered in long green hair like marshweed descended upon the 4 friends as easily as if they were babies. The Ickabog scooped them up and bore them away across the marsh. Oh my goodness, and there's no more chapters, so we're going to have to leave it on that one. Well, have a lovely weekend, and by Monday we should have several more chapters that we'll be able to find out what happens. I knew the Ickabog was real. I hope you did too. And if you'd like to put any comments on your blog, it would be great to see what you're thinking and how you found, and whether you thought it was a huge surprise to them, or whether you secretly thought that the Ickabog might be real after all. I'd love to hear your predictions as well about what you think is going to happen. And I know that this ending to this week will make Mrs. Nicol very happy, because she's been following along in school and she's loving the Ickabog with her pod. So I look forward to talking to you all next week. Have a great weekend, and head over to Purple Mash for your activity.